Thank you everyone for being here today. So for those who were there on Tuesday, we've essentially covered a lot of the commercial and what we call technical considerations with commercializing neuro and neurotechnology. So we looked at, understanding market analysis, business plan and business models, how to look at regulation, reimbursement, IP, and other key considerations. And today we're talking about a very complementary topic, which is fundraising. Naturally, at different stages, startups will have to think about fundraising, sometimes quite a bit in advance. And so we wanted to give a state of the market, where it is today, what does it look like, how do you prepare for that, and some both, I would say, hard skills, soft skills, and other considerations that anyone looking to fundraise should keep in mind. So without further ado, we'll just go through the slides. We have a bit less slides compared to Tuesday. We wanted to go deep in each of them and take the time to talk about them, but we also wanted to answer questions at the end of the call. So we'd probably have a little bit more time today for questions. We noticed last time that there were quite a few, so we wanted to keep time for that. As a reminder, neurotechnology is the industry that we're framing today's discussion within. For us, neurotechnology is not just medical. There are many use cases and considerations to look at. It can touch social, health, and performance topics. Just today, we had a call with one of our clients asking us about, whether the device should be used for focus, for consumer, or maybe it could be used for sleep in the context of a medical issue. These are often questions that are asked even by the same company. So one thing to keep in mind today, we'll obviously address medical devices and keep that in mind when we talk about fundraising. But the way we define neurotechnology goes beyond the medical use cases as we can typically think about. So again, a few words about ourselves. I think we have a couple of new faces today, so we'll just present ourselves quickly. NTX Services, so we're a full service advisory group. We've helped company with go-to-market strategy, strategic planning, technical scientific planning, but also fundraising preparation. So in that regard, we've helped a lot of companies get a full data room ready, think about their plans, think about which investors they should aim for, look at pitch decks and make sure they had a clear narrative. We're also in the final process of getting what is called a broker-dealer license. The reason is that both companies and investors have asked us to connect. Companies want us to help them fundraise throughout the whole process. Investors have been talking to us, wanting to know who we're working with and whether there are companies in the field that they should be looking at. So we are very, very close to having that license, which will allow us not just to do the preparation, but actually work with companies and bring them through the whole fundraising process with investors. So anyone that is interested in talking about this after the session will be more than happy to discuss how we could potentially help. But in a nutshell, we've been together for 4 years as a group. We've done over 100 projects across North America, Europe, and Asia. And when we do these presentations, we both provide empirical experience, we provide our own discussions, but we also have a lot of data and insights from the industry to support our claims. So keep that in mind. Today's discussion is anchored in a lot of facts, but we obviously have our own experience with companies over the years that we like to convey throughout the different content. About myself very quickly. So I've been in Neurotech for about 6-7 years. Before that, I've done quite a bit of work in finance and strategy. So investments, transactions, as well as management consulting, mainly across North America, CPA, CFA by trade. And I've been advising Neurotech startups essentially for about 6 years now.
Thanks, Adam. I work as the CEO of NTX Services, which means I typically staff and project manage all of the projects, quality check all of the content we create, etc. Decide on the vendors, work on our marketing. So my background has been in marketing in my early career, but investments later on. Most recently, prior to NTX Services, I worked at PSP Investments, which is a $200 billion or so pension fund here in Canada. And one of the reasons I started working with NTX Services is because I had a family member who, suffered from a chronic disease and passed away from it. And I saw tremendous potential in this field to support patient quality of life.
Okay, so Just to frame today's session, so I alluded to it a little bit earlier. We have 4 key objectives. So one is planning your upcoming fundraise in light of the current environment. We're going to demystify a little bit the environment we're in. We're talking to many investors, many companies, and we wanted to convey with both facts and discussions kind of where we think the field is and what does that mean for anyone wanting to raise today. We're going to look at methods, tools, and strategies to identify and approach the right investors. We think this is really a key topic. We find that companies that are at a very early stage sometimes say, you know what, a dollar is a dollar, I'll get what I can get. But at the same time, we found that finding the right investors at the right stages is actually tremendously useful. And that can have a big impact on the company's progression in time and having the right partners around the table. So we're going to talk about that. After this, we're also going to talk a bit about, what we call documentation and proof points. What should be in your data room? How should you think about it? Are you ready? Are you not? These are a couple of things that we're going to cover, and we're going to prepare. We're going to end with, with the preparation of discussions with investors, how to think about hard skills and soft skills. How do you prepare for such a thing? We know that some founders are not always comfortable asking for money, if that's how they're thinking about it. We're going to give you a couple of ideas about how to make the process smoother.
Thanks, Adam. So unfortunately, I feel a bit like a bad news bear, but I thought that we needed to spend a few minutes understanding the current market environment, largely because we think it would help founders kind of manage their own expectations and get a better sense of how to navigate today's fundraising environment. Based on the data we have on the 2,000 or so neurotechnology companies that we actively track, one of the things that we've observed so far is that both the number of deals and by capital invested, it's really near all-time lows. Something to keep in mind, we're planning on publishing an expanded and more granular information on fundraising data in line with Neurotech X's Buzz and Review in the first quarter of 2024, but I just wanted to give people a sense of the direction today. The news in the neurotechnology industry seems to track essentially broader trends in the healthcare sector. So 2023, for example, has been dubbed a year of reckoning for medtech startups in particular. In medtech and med devices as a whole, for example, funding was really at the lowest level of investment since 2015. And I think this is really related to a lot of what we talked about in our earlier session, which was all of the barriers to scaling in healthcare. We believe that ecosystem players are really starting to realize that there are, in fact, clear barriers to scale in the healthcare system, and that not all startups are prepared to address those barriers. Beyond this, I think, as a founder, when you're discussing your project with VC funds, it's really important to understand that these funds themselves are a business and they are also struggling to raise capital for their own businesses. VC funds tend to be funded by what are called limited partners. These are typically high net worth individuals, pension funds, or endowment funds. And they have kind of shifted allocation away from VC funds as a category. Now, what's also interesting to note is that it's not that, although newer funds are having trouble raising, it's not that the industry itself has no quote unquote dry powder or capital that is not available to disperse today. It's just that they have, anecdotally, based on our conversations, They've really been more focused on their own portfolio companies and their existing deal pipeline versus actively making new investments in this market environment. So what does this mean for a founder today? I think you can certainly expect longer timelines to close a round. I think you will likely face more pointed questions on commercialization and the expected pathway to profitability. And I think you can also expect possibly a more difficult discussion around valuation. However, what we would encourage founders to do is develop and follow a robust process and remain focused and persistent throughout.
Yeah. So how can a neurotech startup thrive in this challenging environment? So a few things that we want to give kind of advice on. The first one is, as a neuro startup, there is a technical and scientific basis. Even for consumer companies, there will be such a thing as, making sure your claim can be properly supported and that you're adding a lot of value from a technical standpoint. So executing will be key. And depending on the phase you're on, it will be very important to show investors that the plan you had up to the point where you're at now has been achieved. So if you're, for example, at the point where you're moving from preclinical, so let's say animal studies to clinical phase, and let's say you're about to raise a seed or a Series A, and you want to say, I've just done my first in human, I am raising right now, and this is my next plan, it will be a very good narrative to say, this is where I was at my last raise, this is what I had committed to do. I have achieved this milestone. I have passed these technical and scientific objectives that I was aiming for, and I am now looking for the next step. Now, if you think about scientific prowess and kind of determining, getting the right research across, non-dilutive funding is very, very useful. Whatever the size of your company, actually, getting non-dilutive funding could be from NIH, it could be different grants, it could be working with an academic partner that might also fund the research because there's value for them. But I would say executing and being smart or, clever about how you leverage the different sources of funds could be good. And the truth is it's a win-win. If there's a grant about a topic, it's because it's a topic of interest for the organization providing the grant. If it's something that is also covered through a university, there's also a lot of value for them to look at a topic. So get the science across and make sure that you're optimizing the fundraising in that regard with public funds if you can. The second point is defining a clear go-to-market strategy with a view on the pathway to profitability that demonstrates an awareness of the current efficiencies in the healthcare system. So there's a lot to unpack here. So I'll just go in terms of into the different concepts. So go-to-market strategy. How do I go from what I have to actually having patients and users use my solution? So there's a question of regulation reimbursement. There's a question of being prescribed. There's a question essentially of people adopting and continuing to use a solution. So you have to think about that strategy, but you also have to know how are you going to be profitable in time. So for a while, the notion of am I going to get revenues early and then after revenues, am I going to be profitable enough was a little less of an area of focus because there was there was more capital in the market. People were investing more broadly, were willing to take more risks because they found an innovation really interesting and they wanted to see it come to fruition. With what Radhika just showed on the previous slide, the market has evolved. And I would say that the question about when are you going to generate a revenue and how are you going to be profitable is more and more important. And that goes down to the last point about the inefficiencies in the healthcare system. To prove that your solution will add value, you need to prove that you're really solving a problem in the healthcare system today, and that you can also fit in that healthcare system. And that goes back to what we talked about on Tuesday. How can you demonstrate that you fit in the treatment ladder in the reality of the healthcare system? I'll go down to the 2 points at the bottom. At the left, we talked about focus on building and maintaining investor relationships. So what we've seen very well, some companies have done it very, very well, is they have a newsletter. And even if you're not yet an investor, even if you're not yet a collaborator, they've accumulated emails of people that were interested in being kept apprised. And they provide a monthly or quarterly quick email saying, this is what we've achieved. This is what we're looking for. Sometimes they ask for help. Anyone that knows about a partner that does this, or if anyone knows about a business angel that does that, please let us know. And we find that that keeps people in tune, and you'd be surprised at how many people actually, take a quick read. And the moment you reach back to an investor, for example, when you're ready to raise, they might actually have read those newsletters, and they might have actually been quite impressed by the progress and the fact that you were consistent in giving these updates and sharing what you did with the company. The last point that we would talk about, and it's absolutely non-negligible, is that in the current economic cycle, the time it might take to raise and the hard conversations that someone might get, it can be very difficult on founder mental health. So what we suggest is, focus on what's within your control, be patient, be mindful about what you do and don't do. But, as obvious as it might sound, don't be too hard on yourself, because, we've seen founders sometimes being surprised in a way, or happy about how easy it might have been to raise the previous round. And then they're like, oh my God, I thought it would be something alike, and now it's much harder. It might be because they're at a later stage. It might be the current environment, but nonetheless, be prepared to have a long path ahead, something that you have to be thoughtful about. If you plan well, it might go very, very well, but nonetheless, practice, I would say patience and acceptability of the elements that are not in your control.
So, I mean, we talked about trying to understand when you're ready for a fundraise. The honest answer to that question would be that it depends, right? And what it really depends on is what the use of funds for your company will be, and what is the key risk factor a potential investor is looking to de-risk at each stage of the company development. So for example, at the pre-seed stage, what people are really looking to de-risk is the technical risk, right? So things like maybe you have evidence of safety or efficacy in early animal models. Maybe you will have some early publications. Maybe you have qualifications of the technical team. Maybe there's some IP that you've managed to spin out. Maybe there's some initial market validation with key stakeholders across the healthcare systems. And hopefully you've at least had some kind of initial informal discussion with the health authority and tried to develop at least an early view on your expected regulatory pathway, if you're a medical application, of course. Let's say we move on to seed. At this point, investors are aware that it's still an early stage company, but what they're really looking to de-risk is understanding product market fit. So at this point, the company's job is really to do their market analysis, demonstrate product market fit, accurately give investors a sense of how much it would cost to reach their eventual milestones, and then potentially maybe some early evidence of safety and efficacy from healthcare regulators. So by this we mean things like early dialogues or let's say pre-submissions, etc. At the Series A stage, what investors are really looking to de-risk is really go-to-market risk, right? At this point, a lot of what we talked about in session 1 comes into play. You need to define a clear go-to-market strategy for your product or solution. I think it would help to at least have a well-defined market access strategy at this stage. Not necessarily that you would have started executing on it, but at least that you know what's needed to be done. And all of these should be kind of reflected in the hiring plan you have for your organization on the raise. Finally, partnerships or early discussions with research institutions or healthcare providers for the larger trials that you will have to do later on, if it's applicable to your situation, of course. At the Series B stage, what investors are really looking to de-risk is TAM expansion risk. So this is the risk that you will not be able to acquire a significant proportion of your total addressable market. And that's where things that are particular to breakthrough tech really come into play. The first point, market unfamiliarity, is really about defining, defining a market that has never existed before. And this is really a challenge, particularly for invasive neurotech companies, where there may not necessarily be a market based on their indication that already exists. It's when you're starting to think a little bit more seriously about competitors and how easy or difficult it would be to quote unquote get shifted in the process. You start dealing with bigger operational challenges. You have to start thinking about things like resource allocation, both from a personnel and a financial point of view, the risk of poor attrition, and then a little bit more seriously about economic and regulatory factors. At Series C+, from here on, the previous risk points should have ideally been de-risked to a large extent. But at this point, you're really thinking about what are the core values, hiring for cultural fits going forward, leadership alignment, are there training and development programs to make sure that knowledge is spread across the organization, and is there good cross-functional collaboration, essentially preventing a situation where multiple departments work in silo and the organization is not able to be as nimble and move together faster. One thing I want to point out is that every time you're past a certain risk stage, the investor at the next stage is already expecting that risk to have been addressed in the previous stage of funding. So for example, even though culture risk is the key risk that people are looking to de-risk at Series C+, they would have already expected a lot of the previous risk factors identified to have been addressed to some extent.
Yeah, I'll add a few words. So what we're showing here, number one, are key risks. They're not the only risks. And naturally, technical risk is something that could continue. And I could argue that even after the Series C, if you're going to develop new solutions, take a technology and adapt it to new medical indications, this is something that will continuously need to be monitored as you continue, or as you update your own and improve your own product. Three things to keep in mind: the type of solution you have, the type of investor you're looking for, and the market timing will all have an impact on what we're showing on the right side. Because the truth is in a very warm market, if you have on top of it a class 3 device, let's say a brain implant, which is highly complex, well, in a hot market, you might come in at the Series B and say, look, I'm about to do a first in human, but I need funding for that. That could maybe work. In other cases, when the market is a little bit colder like it is now, someone might say, well, actually, when I look at your life stage, you look more like a Series A than a B, or a C even in some cases. I would have expected to see that earlier, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable giving you that amount. You're asking for too much given your stage, and the valuations right now don't really make sense with how much you're raising. The dilution, it would be off. You dilute yourself too much. So long story short, you have to also understand who you are as a company. It is possible that you say, look, my solution is class 1 or class 2. I'm quite advanced because it's a lab spinoff and I've already proven a lot. I have a strategic investor or a financial investor that understands. They're super excited to stay behind me. They see a lot of value. So even though, the level of proof that I have is great for them. What they love the technical side and they're less worried about the market. And you might find another investor that would say, I want a lot of de-risking on the market size. I wish you had some sales. I wish you had a proof that you're getting traction. It will really depend. So keep this slide as a framework to leverage. But as you're talking to investors, learn how they're reacting, which type of investors are warmer to your situation, which ones might think you're not ready yet. And you might need to adjust a little bit what your expectations based on that.
So we did something a bit controversial with this presentation. We're purposely not giving a session on pitch decks. And the reason we're not doing that is not because we believe pitch decks are not important. In fact, they're a very important marketing tool. It's just that there are close to 1 million resources out there on the internet. There are accelerators, their previous founders, etc. They all have conflicting views on pitch decks. And it's fairly important for a founder to essentially develop their own style in line with their own personal presentation style. What we're going to focus on is another aspect of of fundraising, which is the data room. What the data room is essentially a secure online repository. It's used for storing, managing, and sharing all of the sensitive documents or information that you're going to use during your fundraising and that investors will look at during the due diligence process. It's something that we found is often overlooked. However, what we will say is that many pitch decks can lead to a due diligence process, but not all due diligence processes result in an investment. Essentially, what are you looking in a data room? Ideally, you're looking for security. You don't want all of your sensitive information out there. Access control. So a lot of data room tools typically report to you who has had access to your information, who has downloaded it, etc. They provide some audit trail, right? So you have a sense of who last edited an organization, a document. Organization is also fairly important in a data room because ideally you want to keep in mind that some funds review close to a few thousand companies a year. So you want to make it as easy and efficient for them as possible to find the information they need to take an investment decision. Essentially, ideally, you would not have expensive infrastructure for your data room, and ideally something that you could share with investors regardless of geography. We've given some examples of common data room providers. I think another tool that's widely used is even SharePoint by Microsoft. So they're widely available. Please shop around and find the one that best fits your needs.
Yeah, so what can you expect to share in a data room? So first of all, as you'll see on the left side, structure is key. Now, we've given you some categories. You might prefer to structure your information differently, and that's more than okay. But you do not want an investor to open your data room and to kind of, scramble, go around, try to find some information and kind of struggle to get there. What we start with, the business plan is essentially, we talked about it earlier this week. It's a good summary of the key items that, are of key importance for your business, and it essentially is a bit of a summary in a way of the stuff that will be detailed in your data room. So if you look at the categories on the left, your business plan will need to talk about the market potential. It will need to talk about your product roadmap, about the competitive analysis, about your IP strategy. So the business plan can almost be, if structured well, almost like a tracker, like the starting point to say, I've shown you my pitch deck. You wanted to know more. You're now reading my business plan, which is well structured, and you're still interested in learning more. So each item of my business plan, you want to double click. Let's get in the data room. Let's really start opening the folders and seeing if you're getting the answer. So let's take a couple of examples. Market potential. You might have information in your business plan, but if you get to the folder, you might have very detailed market sizing analysis. You might segment your market by geography, by sub-medical indication, by type of patients. You might have reports that you purchased or reports that your consultants might have done for you. You might have an analysis of the market risks and how you're thinking about mitigating them. So there could be a lot of information in there. The product roadmap, this one can vary a lot, again, depending on the life stage of your company, where you're at in your R&D, whether you're software and or hardware, this will vary a lot, but you need to show, this is what I have. It is based on these publications and studies. This is my roadmap. These are my milestones. This is how I'm going to achieve them. If you have partners, like research partners or others, this will also be greatly appreciated to be shown there. Now, competitive review This one is an interesting one. We've done a very large amount of competitive reviews, and when we NTX Services look at this, I think you can think about it from a, who's my direct competitor, who's indirect, who's a substitute. And we also tend to look at trials to be very comprehensive. So there's no surprise. If you're going to commercialize in a couple of years, it's important to know who else is working on things that could impact your competitive landscape once you commercialize. And in that regard, the competitive review, one question we often get from companies is, well, am I not raising the flag here? Am I not showing my own investors that I have a crowded market? Well, it depends, because showing that others are trying to address the problem is not a bad sign necessarily. It shows that there's a need and that it's something that people are working on. When it comes to regulation, we talked about it last time. It could help if there's a predicate for something a little bit similar that could help you get in the market more easily. And more importantly, it shows awareness. I know my market. I know exactly who I'm competing with, and I know why my specifications and the way I'm addressing this is different. So it is not just the name of a competitor. It is exactly, the way we look at it, at least, is, detailing what they're doing and how you differ from them. Claiming you don't know is not going to impress anyone. Saying I have one competitor and it's X and that's it will also kind of raise more flags than if you actually show that you've done your work. IP strategy, and we talked about it last time. There will be a lot of questions. What type of patent is it? Which countries is it covered in? What's your roadmap? What's a trade secret versus a patent? It doesn't mean everything needs to be patented. It just means that you need to have a plan for that. Clinical regulatory reimbursement, we talked about it 2 days ago. I won't go into much detail, but there's a lot of value in showing even, communications with regulators, discussing essentially the certifications you've obtained, the steps you've taken in that regard for verification and validation, for example, and how you're aiming to get to that stage. This is something that will be greatly appreciated. Go to market. So that's also a big topic. And as we said earlier, obviously, if you're at a seed stage, it's not going to be the same expectation as if you're in a Series A or B. But this is really getting a little more detail. So what are my communication channels? What are my pipelines? Do I have letters of intent? So have people said, I am committing to purchase X at that price if this is commercialized, or at least some form of commitment to collaborate or to purchase? What is my marketing plan? Do I have partnerships to distribute? So that's not bad at all. If you've already identified which specialized distributors you might want to work with. Who are your KOLs? Who are your key opinion leaders? Who are the patients or KOLs that have already shown interest? Pricing is a big one too, and promotion and communication. There's also the notion of patient access, which you could consider to be kind of an additional step here. Can you show what the patient journey is? Someone might be a medtech investor. It doesn't mean that they know the patient journey and the reality of every single indication. So can you show that you're aware? Can you show the stakeholders that you want to communicate with, that you want to have as potentially KOLs or people that would, refer your solution? And you know what the distribution channels are. So we'll do a few more on the next slide. Organizational structure is also very important. And I think that essentially when you're a very, very early stage, an investor invests in the team. If you're 3 co-founders, let's say CTO, CSO, CEO, there's going to be a lot of importance on who you are, what you've done, and how you're thinking about this. Now, as you grow, it's not just about what your org looks like. It's about what your org might look like. What is the target org chart? Who are you going to hire with the money that you're getting from the investment? And it's always that balance, hire the right people at the right time. Don't be too lean, don't be too aggressive. So there's no one size fit all, but obviously it's important to show you have a plan. And the board of advisors and directors will also matter. The board of advisor, it's something interesting. It shows obviously some form of, stamping and approval. That advisor, which is an expert in my field, decided to be with my company. I am proud to show their profile in, my data room. I'm going to show their bio. The question that would follow, though, is, okay, so they're your advisor. I'm very happy to see this, but concretely speaking, so what do you do? Do you chat every quarter? Are they involved? Are they giving you introductions? If you start showing people's profiles, it has to be commensurate with the way you're engaging with them in the context of your company. If you have 10 pages on one person that you've talked to once and that said they could help at some point, that is not going to help necessarily to prove the point that you have a robust team around you. Structure and governance. So we've seen a lot of gaps when we ask companies for data room to work with them. Sometimes you have an official legal document of incorporation. Most companies have never looked at that again. There are no minutes, the cap table is some form of Excel file. It's interesting to see that there's different level of preparation. So what I would say in that regard is, look at what you have, compile it, organize it as well as you can. And this is always something that naturally an investor that is really getting to that stage of the investment will just ask for more information for, or help you even if there are changes to be made. And that's something to keep in mind. When you're a very early stage, an investor might say, I understand what you're telling me with the cap table, but here are a couple of things that I would actually think about differently. Why is this person, which is not even involved in your startup anymore, holding that much equity? You might be challenged on those points. So get ready for them, but maybe, if there are things you just don't have or you're not sure about, they will come up in any case when you get to the investor discussions. Last two elements, which are very financial in nature, and these are things that we've worked on a lot of company with, is, can you show your historical financials? Can you show how you've raised and the use of funds? So if you've raised X dollars, what were your objectives, and did you manage to actually abide by those objectives? What are your projected financials? 24 to 36 months is a classic period. If you want to show longer, that's okay. But if you're going to show, let's say, monthly for the next 12 months, don't show monthly for the next 5 years. People were going to realize that at this point, you probably took a yearly number and divided it by 12. So only show monthly if it's useful, and it shows managing cash flows. But in general, 24 to 36 with, let's say, 1 or 2 years of monthly can be a good way to think about it. Link this to the burn rate. How much are you burning? How much are you spending every month? And how is that going to change after you're getting an investment? And think about the deal terms. And the deal terms is a tricky one. If the market is hot and your solution is very popular, eventually you might have more of a say on what the terms might be. However, many investors will say, don't even tell me what you think. I'm the lead and I'm going to tell you what my terms are. And then that's how it's going to go. I'm giving you two extremes in that regard, but I think it's important to know that deal terms is something that can.
Yeah, and taking deal terms from investors can actually be a favorable thing in a hot market like it was in 2021. Because, for example, the valuation they may give you would possibly be even higher than you yourself would have asked for. But naturally, the situation today is a little different. And that's why we kind of started with the market environment as an anchor point to this presentation.
Absolutely. And it goes back also to everything we've shown above. If you're showing a clear strategy, data, facts, R&D, financial info, and you really have a thoughtful plan, it also becomes a little harder, right, for an investor to start negotiating very aggressively because you have something to base yourself on. And finally, something that's really, really, really important, and it's a topic that's been discussed about investors more than ever, I would say, is, what about your exit? So who could be in a strategic acquirer? Who might take this company off, from my plate down the road? Are you going to sell? Who could be the big player that might be interested in this? And it's important because, many VCs in this environment have essentially suffered a little bit from, I'm a Series A investor. So I take an investment, I invest, and then I'm, as I go to Series B, C, D, F, I might shed some percentages off my position. Eventually, I'll get there. However, when that doesn't happen, you're left with a company that has a theoretical value based on the last raise, but you might go into a very, very much of a down round. When you say, wow, I invested at 200 million, it's worth 30. There's no strategic acquirer. What do I do now? It's almost a write-off at this point. So long story short, it's always been important, but we've seen more and more investors say, when I invest, I'm going to think in advance about who you might be selling this company to, who could be a strategic acquirer, not just hoping that you'll go through the rounds and eventually IPO. It's a possibility, but naturally synergies with strategic investors, something that has a significant value if you can start showing examples. Even better if you've had discussions already. So I'll continue a little bit on the sources of funds. Again, a little bit like what we've shown before, this is not something that is as static as the slide makes it seem to be, but these are just more guidelines about who you should aim for. So the first category, which is kind of, government and other non-dilutive funding, that is always a source of fund. If you're in an R&D based company, there is no reason to think that, even as you've commercialized, you might not benefit from other grants and other sources of funding for new indications, for new research, and for new initiatives. But obviously, when you're very early stage, this can be, a make or break situation where this is really what gets you off the ground. After this, we can think about in order, accelerators and incubators, albeit many don't invest. So this is a case-by-case situation. Business angels and angel networks. So you have individuals or you have networks of specialized investors that were often, founders themselves, sold their company, made money in that regard, and are then excited to invest and support other entrepreneurs with that. You then kind of graduate in a way to seed funds, Series A, and onwards. We've mapped this to stages, right, of kind of where you're at. Do you have just a concept? Do you have preclinical? Do you have animal studies? Do you have a clinical phase? So are you actually getting in human studies and getting across the regulatory pathway, or are you actually commercializing? Things can move. We've talked about it earlier, but it's important to know that, even if you're at a certain stage, it is not bad to get to know the next investor. So even if you might go and raise only with business angels at this point, I don't think that seed funds would necessarily refuse to talk to you. If anything, they'll be excited to get to know you. And even if you're a little bit too early, they'll say, you know what? Why don't we keep in touch? Why don't you tell me what's happening? And we can maybe get involved in the next round. And once you finish your pre-seed, take that example. They'll be delighted to know that you did. They'll say, thank you for keeping me apprised. And as we said earlier, maybe send them an email every so often, keep them apprised of the progress. That way, when you get to the next funding round, you're not a stranger, they know about you, and they're actually, you might be thinking, you know what? They've been abiding by everything they told me so far, and I'm excited that I'm still in touch with that person. So think about your next step quite early on. So another thing here to keep in mind, we've double clicked a little bit on what we showed you. There's the notion of the use of funds on the left side. So we've alluded to the stage, the sources of funds, and then what we really want to emphasize on is finding the right fit. So let's talk about angels and business angels and business angel networks. So they're very, very, very much, they're very different in terms of their level of sophistication, and there are varying levels of understanding of a technology. You can have business angels that made their money in sector A, and they're just excited by healthcare or by technology in general, and they'd be like, hey, I want to invest in this, but they might not understand your industry at all. However, you have also investors and networks of business angels that are deeply specialized and that will be more than excited to give you advice, get on your board, and be very involved. So it's important to understand, and a mix might not necessarily be a bad thing. I would say that something to try and avoid, though, is to go, unless you have to, with only investors that do not know your industry and that on top of it want to get involved. I mean, if you have a board of investors that have never been in healthcare, once you get to your next round, it's going to complicate matters quite a lot, because the current pool of people that are involved in making decisions or influencing them are people that might not be that exciting to talk to for your next investor. And they might feel like it's going to be very hard to get things across if, people that are on the board and helping with decisions or just very involved as investors are not people from your industry. Geographic constraints are important. Some investors will say, I want to encourage people in my state, in my country. There are different nuances there. So this is obviously something that you should keep in mind.
Yeah, and generally speaking, less so for individual angels, but angel groups tend to be local. So if you're reaching for this type of investor, looking for angel groups within your region is probably the best strategy.
Absolutely. Try to understand who might be your lead investor. So the notion of lead investor at the business angel phase is a little more blurry. Typically the lead investor sets the term. Now here, even though you might not have one person setting the term alone, it's important to know, who's involved, who understands my company, and who might want to be on my board, and who is really the voice of the group. Sometimes they've known each other before, sometimes they don't. But it's not a bad thing to try and think about it in terms of, who is the key person within such a group of first investors. And finally, weigh reporting requirements against value add when deciding how to approach angel networks. So we've seen companies tell us, my first group was great in some regards, but very hard to manage in others. And, again, don't quote me on that, but, very informally, some investors said, it's not the biggest check that's the most vocal. And, I have this person that put in only a few dollars and they kept asking for more. The investment was very material for them, even though it was not that material for us. And we ended up spending a lot of time answering questions and following up with them. So these things are not always obvious to see in advance, but I would say that business angels can make or break a company. They might be your first check, but it's very important to not underestimate the amount of fit that you might have with those. Now, if we go with the same logic, but we talk about, let's say, VCs, which are not the only investors, just to be clear. You could have a CVC, which is a venture capital group of a strategic partner, of a strategic company, like a pharmaceutical or a medtech company. You have different types of organizations that could be involved, but let's stick to the typical kind of, venture capital group. Look at a firm and try to understand what their investment thesis is. This might be published. This might also be conveyed by looking at other companies they've invested in recently. You can even find on some sources, who was the lead partner. So who led that investment that might actually be interested in my solution. You can also try and develop a founder network. So, if you're really interested in talking to a fund, well, you could always find a company that was invested by them and reach out to them and have an informal chat, entrepreneur to entrepreneur, and say, I'm about to raise, or, I'm looking for great investors. I was curious about it, investor X, because of those reasons. Would love to get your perspective on that. Understand also the value add that investors would bring. Some might lead, some might follow, some might lead and be hands-on. They might be hands-on by bringing a network of experts. They might be hands-on by helping you with the commercialization. They might be hands-on by finding research partners. There are very different resources and expertise that might be given to you. And again, the value there is non-negligible. And it might be interesting, if you want to go to the next level, to understand who their LPs are. So who are the investors of my potential future investors? And is that long-term capital? Is there a risk that, my fund might not be able to follow on with me and continue because they're getting pressure from their own investors? It's really important to understand essentially the full picture of something like that at this stage. So big question we always get, who was historically invested in Neurotech? Who should I talk to? How do I think about this? So one way to think about it is there are many names. There are many, many names. I mean, we have an internal database where we kind of track, who invests in what, how much money do they have available, and so on. And we have hundreds and hundreds of names, even if we're sticking to digital health in Neuro and Neurotech. So this is really just a list which is meant as an example. The other thing to keep in mind is that you might work with generalists, funds that are not specialized in your industry per se. But what we would encourage, especially as you're, graduating to, Series A, B, C, D, and as you're growing as a company, is to at least have a lead investor or a couple of investors that are really specialized in your industry. A generalist that is working with specialized investors will feel more comfortable. They can discuss with those investors. They can, get to know them as they're, coming on the round, and they might actually get comfortable because of them. What is a little bit complicated is if you aim for generalist after generalist, because those investors, and we've seen, many founders talk to us about it, saying, look, they seem patient in the first place, but they don't understand why the study's taking longer. They don't realize why I'm not getting regulatory approval. They don't understand why this is harder than we thought. Whereas specialized investors might sound a little harsher when you get in the meeting with them. You might come out of that and feel like, I'm being challenged a lot and I don't understand why, they were poking me in these areas. You might have, however, realize that once you pass the due diligence with such an investor, you're that much more prepared, and they are really, really aware of what they're investing in. They are essentially trying to make sure that if they give you $1, they know exactly what you're going to try to do with them. And essentially understand what is likely to happen after that. So Radhika, if you want to take it over, I think we have 2 slides that are left.
Yeah, Healthy Amplified, I'm actually going to answer your question here because I was trying to write it out, but I think it's just going to take too long. So I'll just be direct. The CVCs are essentially what tends pharma companies tend to employ a variety of strategies when funding healthcare innovation, right? So the first one is what is a CVC model. So this is where they create a separate entity under either the same or different brand name. And the mandate of that fund is to invest in companies that could have, some form of strategic value for the larger parent pharma company. The differentiator between a CVC and a venture capital fund is that while a venture capital firm may look for financial returns as their metric, a CVC would look for essentially also some form of strategic value to the parent pharma company. Again, to answer, continue answering that question that Healthy Amplified asked, CVCs are not the only vehicle that pharma companies use to invest in companies. Sometimes you have individual departments that could be developing, let's say, novel drugs, et cetera, and they're looking for a digital solution to pair with that solution. Your best bet, however, typically to get as much traction as possible, if you are looking for a strategic investor, is to one, get a, the steps I would follow are, one, I would get a sense of what are their areas of specialty, because they typically tend to have some kind of ownership or understanding of the distribution channel in their specific areas of expertise. And try to understand what they're really, where their new drugs or products are being developed in. So for example, if there's a pharma company that is developing solutions in, let's say, mental health, right? They may be looking to partner with a digital health solution that focuses on depression, for example. And I think there's a case for that. I believe there was an Otsuka investment into Click Therapeutics that was about $300 million and focused solely on the development of an MDD platform.
Yeah, perfect. And just to add, I mean, I think you asked for this digital therapeutics. This is a digital therapeutics. Yes, not just that. You could have some light medical devices. We know some CVCs and pharmas that have invested in that. As Radhika said, though, in those cases, it's often because it's very aligned to an indication they're developing in-house. Also, I would say the further away you're getting from their core business, the more you might find CVCs investing together, so 2 or 3 for a solution that might be good for more than one group. So the more your solution is administrative or for about optimizing different elements, like optimizing a trial, or it's a solution that can abide to many indications, for example, we've seen CVCs invest along one another and essentially work together. So it's really about the fit based on what your solution might.
Actually, for other applications, Healthy Amplified, I do have some cases that we can discuss. Sometimes pharma companies are looking to device-based solutions to essentially help them define and develop secondary endpoints to improve, results from, let's say, their clinical trials. So that's something that you should also be aware of. It's not solely that they would be interested in investing in solutions linked to their core diagnostic and therapeutics area alone.
Yeah, it's really something. It's not an easy one to crack in some instances, right? Because you might be thinking, oh, but my solution fits so well with that pharma, but it might just not be a key priority for them at that point. You know, maybe they're focusing on other types of patients or type of indications or symptom of an indication specifically that they're targeting. So you might say, oh, you're looking at Parkinson's, like, but maybe there's one specific aspect of that. So if your digital health solution was about that, I'd be super interested. But unfortunately, it is not a current internal priority right now. So it's also not as obvious with CVCs as it can be with venture funds. You know, in some cases, you might have the perfect fit, and other factors that a venture fund would have challenged you on might not be as much of a worry, because a CVC might say, look, we have the capacity, let's do it, we see the value. And in other instances, your solution might be a better fit for a financial investor like a venture fund versus a CVC, just simply because it's just not a fit with their thesis at that moment. So.
But I just want to point out a few differences. So Action Potential, which is GSK, GlaxoSmithKline's CVC, does a lot of device-based investing. Merck has actually done some collaborated with InBrain Bioelectronics, which is an invasive neurotech company. Intuitive Ventures is the venture arm of Intuitive Surgical. Naturally, they're looking for more device-based solutions. So there is a mix across the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think we can get to the next slide.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think we've generally, and I think everyone on the call seems familiar with this concept. Relationships and personal networks do play a very critical role in the fundraising process, right? Typically because founders tend to be referred to venture capital funds and vice versa through trusted third parties. But there's also several hard skills that can also help support a successful capital raise, right? I think we'll start with negotiation. I think this is a key part of a founding CEO's role, and discussions with investors are no different. The end goal of any negotiation process here with an investor, though, is a prospective win-win. You have to remain aware that some of these relationships can be very long-term business partnerships. And although you want to, get your point across, you may strategically take decisions that will help support a more cohesive long-term relationship with a given investor. We did mention pitch decks. I think they're an important marketing document. It's very important that you have a compelling one. The purpose of the pitch deck, however, remains a marketing document. However, the product you're selling in this case is the security or the shares of your company in this case. So while it's wonderful to have a great marketing pitch, as you can through a pitch deck, it's really important to, share a lot of information with prospective investors through your data room that helps them develop both trust and comfort in the long-term trajectory of the product or the security in this case that they are purchasing. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that beyond developing chemistry with prospective investors once you meet them, there are some business and project management skills that are going to be fairly key to a founder's investor relations role, right? These can include things like time management and organizational skills. Many founders who have been successful that we work with say that sometimes they have spent up to 40% of their time on fundraising. Marketing and PR skills, right? And then attention to detail, and then depending on the life stage of the company, some level of financial literacy. I think the other thing is that a founder should ideally be able to reliably communicate at some level of detail the expected revenues and costs of the projects and understand the underlying drivers of these business fundamentals. I think the projections on the actual numbers for revenues and costs are less important than the second point, which is understand the underlying drivers, because as entrepreneurs, I'm sure you've all already gotten to the point where you realize that things rarely go according to plan, and in that case, it's fairly important to understand what your levers are. There are many tools that are out there to develop an understanding of these elements in the financial world. One of these is a financial model. We believe from projects we have done that that this can serve as a valuable business planning tool. But we did not include our whole session on financial modeling in this seminar, just because the content is too comprehensive to get into over an hour and a half. One of the benefits of building a financial model is that typically different investors look for different KPIs. For example, some might be interested in your burn rate, some might be interested more in your recurring income or annual recurring revenue, some might be interested in your EBITDA margin, etc. Once you've built a financial model which is driven by the revenues and the costs, you can sort of just report these numbers using the same tool. Then finally, to understand the exit potential of your startup, founders can look at comparable exit or liquidity events. By these, we typically mean M&As or public offerings in their space, to get a sense of, hey, what is the long-term exit potential of my startup, right? What we've seen in terms of things badly done is founders essentially clubbing together comparable deals without necessarily understanding the nuances, right? We've already talked about market conditions, right? So, I mean, we've had situations where founders came to us saying that some of their peers managed to raise X million dollars at Y valuation in 2021. And we essentially have to have like a hard discussion kind of explaining the differences in the market conditions today and help them kind of understand how that might influence how credible the comparable deal from, let's say, 2021 is. I think the other big challenge in breakthrough tech essentially tends to be in finding a true comparable, right? So I think when you're looking at comparable deals, focus on essentially the quality of the comparable rather than the quantity, so that you can more conclusively make an argument to a prospective investor. I think we've talked about the hard skills. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is that your mindset matters as much as some of the hard skills we discussed. Ideally, the willingness to put yourself out there to meet prospective investors matters. Many investors have told us they appreciate the grit that a given CEO has in personally reaching out to them. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, at least for traditional VC funds, most of their partners and associates, their job is, a big part of their job is quote unquote deal sourcing. So don't feel bad about reaching out to them, even if you don't know them as well, because it's part of their job, right? Essentially, it tends to be a numbers game as much as it is about adequate preparation. So just understanding that the hit rate on your reach outs might be lower than you expect. It's completely normal and natural, and everyone goes through that. The other thing, once you're able to get a meeting with a prospective investor, is learning how to be a good storyteller and essentially building early chemistry with the prospective investor. This is particularly important if you're looking at VC funds that have a longer view on a given industry or sector, and typically people who invest in neurotechnology do tend to have that longer term view. They try to also understand whether they can work with a given founder for an extended period of time. I think we'll start touching on a bit of behavioral psychology here, but founders have to find a way to balance the eagerness to fund the project versus the long-term goals of the project. One way to mitigate your personal emotion during what can be for some a frustrating process is by beginning the investor relations process at least 12 months prior to the target close date. We've set 12 months here as a general guideline, but some of the companies that we know tend to start reaching out to investors just to slowly start building relationships as much as 2 years prior to their target close date. I think we've said this before, we're in a bit of a tight market. So it may not be the most conducive to founder mental health. We're well aware of that. We understand that it's tricky when you're running your business because in a way you're living most of your day in the future. I think try to manage what is essentially just a rough seas situation by focusing on items that you can control, making an intentional effort to practice patience, or adjusting your business milestones to reflect the market reality.
Here you go. So thanks, Radhika. Thanks, everyone. We have 20 more minutes. We purposely left a little bit of time for anyone that might have questions for us. So either through the chat, which I know many of you have not been shy about sharing throughout the conversation, or by unmuting yourself, we'd be more than happy to continue the conversation until the end of the session. Okay, I'll take the first one. How often do you see is appropriate to nudge the investors again after the first engagement? It's an interesting question. So I think it depends on what the conversation was. You know, if someone has never applied, you could always try to reach out at someone else in their investment firm, right? Which might be more responsive. You might reach out to them again. If you have reached out and they wanted to organize a call, they said, "Oh, sounds great, let's connect," and there was no call, I don't think anyone should be shy about saying, "Hey, you know, I would be happy to connect. You know, let us know when you'd be available." And then it kind of graduates, because every time you're getting more and more engaged, it's not just even more legitimate to follow up, but you're going to follow up on something specific. So if you sent a pitch deck and they say, you know, we'll get back to you to let you know if we're going to move ahead, it would be okay after 2-3 weeks to follow up and ask, you know, if there's any question or anything else. Even if they say no to you, you might be asking for feedback and understanding what was essentially a blocking factor. Maybe you have an answer now. Maybe you'd have an answer on the next round when you're trying to raise again. So I definitely wouldn't be shy about following up. I just think it's about showing that you understand or you're aware of the previous conversation. I think one thing that would not be appreciated is if someone says, you know, I am not interested by this indication. It is a class 3 device. We do not invest in this. You know, something very clear cut, and you follow up with the exact same problem that you know you haven't addressed, or, you know, not a problem, but with your own reality that you know did not fit. Unless there's a reason to think, like there's a new fund they started or their thesis has changed, it would be a little bit risky to follow up hoping for a different answer if there's no reason to think that that would be the case.
Hi, this is William from Healthy Amplified. Got a question. Based upon your experience, what have you seen that's more likely to be funded and commercially successful? Screening tools and diagnostics, digital therapeutics and treatments in general, or consumer products? Which ones are more likely to be successful in terms of funding, in terms of commercial revenue execution?
I don't think we have the final answer on commercial revenue execution, because we're still working on putting that data together. I think on the funding side, based on the work we did in 2022, so this is a bit out of date today, but just as a reminder, we will publish again in Q1 2024. Our findings were that therapeutics were more likely to get funded than either diagnostics or consumer products.
Appreciate that.
I think it's interesting. This has evolved in time also. We've seen quite a bit of a difference, right? I think a couple of years ago, I would have said consumer was something that, if you came up with something that's, I have a new device, a new approach, it's novel, I think you could position it as a consumer device. I think even, regulators at some point were not sure how to think about those. We know people part of our organization that were part of panels from the FDA, 6-7 years ago about what do we think, how do we deal with neurotech? Is it consumer, is it not? So I would say that consumer is quite popular. And then in time, I would say medical devices and other elements that were always existing, right? One, more proof points were there. One, people were more acquainted with it. There was more of a bar to say, look, I think regulation is important. I think you need to find your use case. I think you need to get all these proof points. And within that category, again, it's not a general rule, but we found that treatments tend to be more popular than diagnostics, simply because for diagnostics, the bar in terms of what you're supposed to do versus the existing possibilities is very, very high. And we've had, again, this is very informal, but we've had quotes from investors, strategics, and not saying, I don't want to diagnose, I want to treat. Like, I want to find a solution to cure the X number of people that are suffering. So again, it is not a formal rule. I mean, diagnostics can work well, but namely because of what we talked about 2 days ago, right, with assessments versus diagnostics and where it is, we find that a solid treatment that is superior and more efficacious for a clear portion of the population tends to lead to more interesting discussion than my diagnostic is another way to find it. It is a little simpler. It might be a little bit earlier. Sometimes the incremental difference is just unfortunately not big enough to warrant an investment for many investors.
I think what I can do, if it's helpful for everyone, Kay, is I can share with you the publication we did in 2022 that essentially broke down in detail. It's fairly long and there's a lot of reading, so I'm sorry to anyone who doesn't like reading, but we can share it with Kay if you want access to it. And this year we're planning on sharing the information in a presentation format again in Q1 2024. Out of curiosity, is research team the name of a company, or is research team a descriptor?
No, I'm just part of the research team for EpiFinder.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Right,
So
perfect.
yeah, no, I was just going to say for everyone I know, thanks, Kay, you've been sharing information. I think you've been sharing our short corporate presentation with the links and everything. I would definitely encourage anyone that wants to continue conversations to reach out to Radhika and I directly. The devil's in the detail, as they all say, and that's typically true with, especially with neurotech and digital health. So more than happy to organize follow-up calls with anyone that would like to discuss.
All right, perfect, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And like Eda mentioned, feel free to reach out to them. I'll include contact info in the survey I'll send out. So thanks again and have a great rest of your day.